Renting out my house on Airbnb always seemed like a good idea. Easy weekend money while I stayed at a friend's place or a cheap hotel. I met people from all over, each with different stories and interesting personalities. I never had any major issues until the day Ramon entered my life. Ramon wasn't a guest who stood out. He booked my house for 3 days, no special requests, no questions, just a simple reservation. As usual, I left the keys in the mailbox with detailed instructions about the house. He was supposed to check out on a Monday morning, and, as always, I would return later to clean and make sure everything was in order. I arrived at my house that cloudy Monday afternoon. The wind was blowing hard, as if something dark was about to happen, but I ignored the feeling and went inside. The house felt strangely quiet, like the air was heavier. The living room light was on, which puzzled me a bit since I always ask guests to turn off the lights before they leave. Something felt off. As I walked through the house, I noticed that everything was exactly as I had left it. No mess, no signs of anything unusual, except for one thing: the master bedroom. The door was closed. It wasn't unusual for guests to close the door, but the detail that sent a chill down my spine was that it was locked from the inside. My heart started pounding. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. I approached the door cautiously, listening for any sound, any movement. I called out Ramon's name, my voice trembling in the suffocating silence. "Ramon, are you still there?" No answer, just an oppressive silence, the kind that makes you feel small, vulnerable. I looked at the gap under the door, and that's when I saw them. 2 feet.
Bare, pale, motionless.
They were facing upward, as if someone was lying on the floor on the other side of the door. A cold chill ran down my spine, and my hands started shaking. What the hell was going on? Who or what was still in that room? I tried turning the knob again, but it was still locked. My panic was rising, and my mind raced with worse and worse scenarios. Was Ramon dead in there? What if someone had killed him? Or worse, what if he was still alive but on the verge of insanity? With trembling hands, I grabbed my phone and called the police. My voice was shaky, and I tried to sound rational, but the truth was, I was terrified. I explained the situation as best as I could, trying to ignore the feeling that someone or something was still on the other side of that door, listening to every word. The minutes felt like hours as I waited for the police. I stood there, staring at that gap under the door, waiting for any sign of movement. My heart was racing, and every sound in the house made me jump. The wind outside seemed to whisper, as if it knew something I didn't. When the police arrived, they acted quickly. They broke down the door with one swift move, and I stood there breathless as they entered the room. What happened next is something I'll never forget. Ramon was sitting on the bed, staring blankly at the wall, as if he was hypnotized by something only he could see. He was filthy, with wrinkled clothes and empty eyes, lost somewhere far beyond that house. Next to him on the mattress was a large, sharp knife. He didn't seem surprised by the presence of the police. In fact, he didn't even seem to register our existence. He just kept murmuring disconnected words, almost like an insane prayer. The police took him away, and as they led him out, he looked at me for a brief moment. That look, empty, yet somehow full of something dark, something I couldn't quite define. I felt a chill that seemed to pierce my soul. After he was taken away, a heavy silence fell over the house. The police said Ramon hadn't committed any crimes, other than staying without permission. They said he was probably in some state of mental confusion, maybe caused by drugs or a nervous breakdown. They found no signs of violence or break-in, so they let him go. But that didn't bring me any relief. Since then, I've felt a presence in the house. Sometimes, when I pass by, I get the feeling that someone is still inside. And on certain nights, when the moon is full and the wind blows hard, I see a shadow in the master bedroom window. I try to avoid it, but I always end up back at that door. And even though I know the house is empty, I always look under the door, waiting to see those feet again. I've always been a fan of escaping to the middle of nowhere. There's nothing like getting away from the chaos of the city and spending a peaceful weekend surrounded by nature, listening only to the sound of trees swaying in the wind and birds singing at dawn. With that idea of peace in mind, I rented a remote cabin on Airbnb. I needed some time alone, away from everything and everyone. The cabin was exactly what I was looking for. Secluded, hidden in a dense forest, miles away from any sign of civilization. When I arrived, the sun was already starting to set, and a sense of tranquility washed over me. The silence there was different, deep, almost overwhelming, but in a comforting way. I locked the cabin's doors and windows as a precaution, but the truth is, I felt safe there, like nothing could reach me in that isolated refuge. The first day was perfect. I walked along the trails nearby, breathed in the fresh air, and at night, I cozied up in front of the fireplace, listening to the crackling flames while sipping a glass of wine.
No rush, no worries.
Just me, the cabin, and the comforting silence of nature. But everything changed that very night. I woke up to a strange sound, something that didn't belong in that peaceful setting. Took me a few seconds to realize what it was until I heard it again. Footsteps. Someone was outside. My heart started pounding in my chest, and I stayed still, trying to listen more carefully. The footsteps were getting closer, slowly, as if whoever it was trying not to make noise. I looked at the clock by the bed. It was 2 a.m. Who would be walking around here at this hour? My mind started racing with possibilities. Maybe it was just an animal or a lost hunter. But then, I heard the sound of something metallic being dragged across the wooden floor outside the cabin. A shiver ran down my spine. That wasn't an animal. I got up slowly, trying not to make any noise. The floor creaked under my feet, but there was no way to avoid it. I grabbed my phone, hoping to call the police, but of course, no signal. I was in the middle of nowhere, completely isolated. I tried to think quickly. I had locked the front door, but had I locked all the windows? And what if that person, or whatever it was, managed to get in? Suddenly, I heard a thud against one of the windows, a sharp knock that made the glass vibrate. My blood ran cold. Whoever was outside wasn't just lost. They wanted to get in. With nowhere to run, I hid in the bathroom, locking the door behind me. I sat there on the cold floor, clutching my phone as if it were my only connection to the outside world. I heard more knocks, now stronger, more insistent. My heart felt like it was about to jump out of my chest. The fear was paralyzing. The knocking continued for a few minutes, but to me it felt like hours. And then suddenly silence. Whatever was out there seemed to have given up. I didn't dare leave the bathroom until morning. When I finally gathered the courage to open the door, I saw the aftermath of the terror that had passed through. The front door was wide open, the lock broken. The inside of the cabin was ransacked. My belongings were scattered across the floor. Cabinets were open, drawers emptied. My laptop and the cash I had stashed away were gone. The intruder had taken everything of value they could find. The feeling of violation was overwhelming. That place, which had once seemed like a safe haven, had turned into a nightmare. The worst part was knowing that no one would come to help me. I was alone, in the middle of nowhere, and the person responsible for my terror was already far away, along with what was left of my peace of mind. I contacted the Airbnb host, hoping for some kind of help or at least a bit of empathy. But all I got was indifference. He didn't seem surprised or concerned at all. "That happens sometimes," was all he said. And when I asked about a refund, he brushed me off, saying he'd look into it, but never got back to me. The cabin, which was supposed to be my refuge, became a bitter reminder of how fear can creep into even the most peaceful places. Since then, I've never been able to spend a night alone in an isolated spot again. And I still wonder if the host knew more than he was letting on. Something about his indifferent response makes me believe he was involved somehow. But I'll never be able to prove it. All that's left is the constant feeling that the real danger was much closer than I ever imagined. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend, away from the city, with my closest friends. We've always loved outdoor adventures, and finding a secluded Airbnb, surrounded by dense forest, seemed like the perfect choice. Away from the hustle and bustle of everyday life, we could finally relax, hike, drink around a campfire, and tell stories late into the night. The cabin we stayed in was small but comfortable. It lacked luxury, but the surrounding environment more than made up for it. We were completely surrounded by old, towering trees, so dense that they blocked out almost all the sunlight in the middle of the afternoon. The only sounds were the leaves whispering in the wind and the occasional distant song of a bird. First, everything was perfect. During the day, we explored the nearby trails and spent hours talking and laughing. But when night fell, a different feeling began to settle in. The silence, which had once seemed so peaceful, now felt strange, too empty. Every little sound seemed amplified, and the darkness around the cabin felt deeper than any normal night. After a long day of hiking, we were all exhausted. We gathered in the cabin's small living room, drinking and laughing at our usual jokes. The fireplace crackled softly, casting dancing shadows on the wooden walls. Outside, the wind had started to blow harder, making the branches of the trees knock against the house. And then we heard it for the first time. Footsteps, coming from the forest. We all froze, our eyes turning to the windows. Probably just an animal, someone suggested, but the sound didn't seem like an animal. It was heavy, rhythmic, clearly human. The sound kept getting closer, but when we rushed to look out the window, all we saw was the impenetrable darkness of the forest. There was no one there. We tried to laugh it off, to downplay the growing fear. Probably just an echo from far away, we told each other. But the mood had shifted. The lightheartedness of the night had been replaced by a palpable tension, as if something was watching us from out there, hidden in the shadows. We tried to ignore the unease and continued with our evening, but none of us could truly relax. That's when the second incident happened. A flash of light, intense and sudden, lit up the cabin for a split second. We all saw it. It was as if something had exploded or burned outside, but there was no sound, just the flash and then absolute silence. We ran outside, using flashlights to try and figure out what had happened, but there was nothing. No campfire, no sign of anything burned. Just the darkness of the forest, more oppressive than ever. We decided the best thing to do was to go back inside and try to forget what had just happened, but the fear had already set in. No one was willing to admit it, but we all felt that something was very wrong. The hours dragged on and sleep seemed impossible. Every little sound outside made our hearts race. The tension was unbearable. Then we heard the scream. It was high-pitched, desperate, echoing through the forest. It didn't sound human, but it didn't belong to any animal we knew either. The sound chilled my blood. We all looked at each other, fear written all over our faces. Something or someone was out there, surrounding us, waiting, or worse, getting closer. We rushed outside, our flashlights shaking in our hands, trying to figure out where the sound had come from. That's when we saw it. A hooded figure, standing among the trees, far enough away to be just a shadow in the night, but close enough that we knew it was watching us. It didn't move. It just stood there, motionless, as if it was studying us. Panic took over all of us. We shouted for it to leave, but the figure didn't respond. It remained still, a silent, menacing presence in the middle of the darkness. Without waiting any longer, we made the only decision that seemed possible: to get out of there. Within minutes, we hastily packed our things, not caring about what we left behind. We got in our cars and drove off, not looking back. The fear that the figure might be following us was overwhelming, but we didn't stop until we were miles away from that cursed cabin. Even now, far from that forest, the feeling that something was watching us that night hasn't left me. We never found out what the footsteps were, what caused the flash of light, or who that hooded figure was. Maybe it was just a cruel prank, or maybe something much worse. But one thing I know for sure: I'm never going back to that place, and no amount of peace in nature could ever convince me otherwise.